right, here we go. Hey, folks, welcome to episode 16 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. We've got a lot to cover for you on this episode. 3 interviews lined up for today. Coming up shortly, a conversation with David Clement. He's with the Consumer Choice Center. We'll talk trade wars and tariffs and why all of this is bad news for consumers in both Canada and the U.S. We'll also focus on Canada's supply management system. Once again, it looks like supply management could be a barrier to Canada reaching a crucial trade agreement, and the irony is that we would probably be better off without it. Meanwhile, speaking of Canada-U.S. relations, a new report from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute makes the case for looking beyond a mere trade agreement with the U.S. What we need, they say, is something much bigger, a grand bargain, if you will, what the report calls a path to prosperity, security, and strength. We'll hear from Institute Senior Fellow Richard Shimooka, one of the authors of this report, about what it would take to get a broader agreement, not just trade, but also things like energy, security, and defense. Plus, we'll talk today about protests in Canada and the rights that protesters enjoy in this country, and also the laws that come into play when protests cross a line. From the convoy protest to the university encampment protest, Canada has seen its fair share of large, unruly, and controversial protests in recent years. But it is also crucial that we uphold freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. To that end, the Canadian Constitution Foundation has released a new guide to safe and legal protest in Canada, what both protesters and police need to know and understand about rights and responsibilities. We'll speak with CCF counsel Josh Dehaas coming up later. But first, we'll start with the news we talked about on the last podcast, the new tariff threat from U.S. President Donald Trump threatening a new 35% tariff to be applied to Canadian imports as of August 1st. Now, that was contained in a letter to Canada that Donald Trump published or posted on social media, one of many such letters that the U.S. president has released or posted in recent days, targeting various countries and threatening various levels of tariffs. Now, we'll see whether he follows through on all of these threats. But it certainly seems like it's a bit of a turn here, that we're moving in a different direction and not a good one. Now, the thing is, as far as Canada is concerned, right, we were under the impression anyway that we were working toward a July 21st deadline to get some sort of agreement in place. Now, maybe this August 1st deadline that Donald Trump has thrown out, maybe that represents a new target date. And it appears as though the Prime Minister is taking it that way. And we didn't get much of a reaction or a public statement from Prime Minister Mark Carney, just kind of a statement posted on social media that they're going to keep working toward what is now, I guess, a revised August 1st deadline. And look, maybe that's the smart way to play this, to not take the bait, to not overreact, and to just keep working toward an agreement. Now, we'll see what it takes to get to an agreement or what that maybe looks like in the end, because the Americans have identified other issues, namely supply management, that we'll get to in just a second here. But perhaps, sure, maybe it is the smarter approach to just negotiate behind closed doors, don't do all of this in public, and like I say, don't take the bait from the U.S. president, if that's what it is. I mean, who really knows? I think the problem for the Liberals right now, for Mark Carney in particular, is the perception that they created, or the image and brand that they really tried to build around Mark Carney, that he was the guy to stand up to Donald Trump, right? Hashtag elbows up. This was a big part of what the Liberals campaigned on. Now, the Liberals might argue that, well, look, we felt that he was the best guy to get a deal, and we'll see whether or not that proves to be true and what this all looks like at the end of the day, which is maybe a fair point. But what do they mean by elbows up? What do they mean by we're going to, stand up to Donald Trump? And so I think that's where there's maybe a bit of a disconnect here, that here we've got a new threat, a pretty aggressive threat from Donald Trump, and there's not really much of a reaction. We saw just recently when Donald Trump canceled trade talks, or announced that trade talks were going to be canceled, Canada very quickly backed down on the digital services tax. Again, maybe we're just as well to get rid of that tax. But that's a weird way to go about it, especially if your argument is we're going to stand up to this guy, elbows up, as it were. So an interesting question posed over the weekend to Industry Minister Melanie Joly about all of this. What happened to elbows up? Or what did Canadians take that to mean? Or what should we take it to mean? How do we reconcile that kind of rhetoric with what we're seeing right now?
Your government ran on the promise of being elbows up and standing up for Canadians, but respectfully, that hasn't been happening. So do you think Canadians have been misled by the promises of your government?
I reject that premise. What I'm saying is, of course, we will make sure that we defend our workers. That has been at the core of everything we've been doing. But at the same time, we're dealing with a very unpredictable U.S. administration. We're not the only ones. That's the case for the EU, and I won't talk, of course, for my colleague Séjourné, but that's the case also for every single country on this planet. So my point is right now is that we need to make sure that we're in action mode, we're in solution mode with other countries, because we're not alone. And so that's why 15 days after the agreement that was signed between Prime Minister Carney and President von der Leyen, we're meeting here in Ottawa. And within the next week, so the end of the summer, I'll be going to Europe, because we need to make sure that our businesses, our industries in Canada, are able to have access to European markets, and same for European companies having access to Canada. And that's our goal. Because while the U.S. will decide to undergo this protectionism path, we know that together we can be in favor of free and open markets, and that's also a really good way to negotiate.
Respectfully, Minister, there was no strong response, though, to, let's say, the increase of steel and aluminum tariffs. There was no strong response to the threat of copper tariffs incoming. Your government had to remove the DST simply just to get back to the negotiating table. So respectfully, what is the government actually doing to negotiate with the U.S. and stand up for Canadians? Well,
you're pretty much asking the same question as your colleagues. My answer is always the same. We won't negotiate in public, and we'll let the Prime Minister negotiate. And, it's a reality that pretty much all world leaders are dealing with right now. And, of course, we're coordinating with the EU, we're coordinating with other countries that are negotiating. That's why economic diplomacy is so important right now. But fundamentally, while these negotiations are happening, we need to realign ourselves with trusted partners. And today what you're seeing is a realignment between trusted partners.
Okay, so an interesting exchange there between that reporter and Industry Minister Melanie Joly. And sure, we'll see at the end of the day what this all looks like. Where are we at as of August 1st? Where are we at, beyond that? Are we going to get some kind of agreement in place? What are we sacrificing to get there? What does the end result look like? Is Canada going to be better off as a result? And I think ultimately, that's how this government will be judged. But right now, it definitely feels like a disconnect between the strategy and practice, and the strategy that was sold to Canadians, or the kind of rhetoric that was sold to Canadians. We'll see where it all goes from here. So when we come back, a conversation with David Clement from the Consumer Choice Center. We'll talk about supply management. We'll talk about tariffs and trade talks. Much more to get to. This is the Rob Breakenridge Show. Joining us now for more on the latest tariff threats from Donald Trump and whether supply management may yet again be an obstacle to getting a trade deal for Canada. Very pleased to welcome to the program here David Clement. He is North American Affairs Manager with the Consumer Choice Center, consumerchoicecenter.org. David, great to have you with us here.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, the frustration of these trade wars, these tariff tactics dragging on. It's bad news for Canadian consumers, bad news for American consumers. Just in a big sense, first of all, how frustrating is this?
Well, it's frustrating because it feels like it's economic illiteracy all the way down. So trade wars are bad. Tariffs are bad. Tariffs are taxes predominantly paid for by domestic consumers. And so Donald Trump is erratic, and he's tearing up the greatest trading relationship that has probably ever existed. And our government, depending on the week, is having retaliatory tariffs that are just tax increases on Canadians. And so we almost have this race to the bottom on bad economic policy. So incredibly frustrating.
It's weird, and we'll get into supply management, but maybe a bit of foreshadowing was what happened with the digital services tax, and the Americans have been raising concern over this for a couple of years now. But Donald Trump threatens to call off talks, and all of a sudden, we back away from the digital services tax. A weird way to go about policy, but I guess also kind of a win for consumers.
You're right. It's not the best way to get there, but it is a win. And the optics of Trump saying jump and Canada is saying how high doesn't look great, but
Right.
it's a policy that would have been worthwhile to get rid of, regardless of who the president was, because it was genuinely bad for Canadians, and there was a ton of criticism um, on the policy in advance from Canadians saying, "Hey, this isn't a particularly good idea." Now, it's important to remember that yes, a lot of these conversations and grievances are framed within since Donald Trump took office, but the digital service tax was something that the Biden administration complained about and was
Yeah.
heavily critical of. Supply management is something that the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and then Trump again, the second time around, have complained about. So there is a bit of a disconnect because it's almost like people are forgetting that these grievances have existed for a long time. And on supply management, there seems to be collective amnesia that the trade deal with the UK fell through because of supply management. CETA was so difficult and has been slow to be ratified because of supply management. And so uh, it, it's framed in the context of Donald Trump, and Canadians instinctually have this negative, visceral reaction to Trump. And I get that. I have that as well. But that doesn't mean that we have to defend everything that we do, especially when it comes with such a high cost.
Well, and what's weird too about supply management, David, and the timing of all of this, the House and the Senate both recently passed this bill C-202, a Bloc Québécois bill, no less, that legally prevents the government from even allowing supply management to be on the table in trade talks. So, on top of the fact that, as you say, it's been a trade irritant many times over for Canada, now we're almost doubling down on it.
Well, yeah, so one note on that. It doesn't prevent an act of parliament to unwind the system. It just protects it from trade concessions.
Right.
So there is still a path to get rid of it. But the issue that I have is, so a lot of people who are maybe on the fence will say, well, why would we want to open the market to the US? The Trump administration are not reliable trading partners. They've thrown decades of economic partnership and history into the trash bin. Why would we want to give them a concession here? Fine, I understand that point of view. But when Mark Carney is in the UK talking to Keir Starmer, what is one of the British grievances about Canada's markets? It's supply management. When he's in Europe talking to Emmanuel Macron, I guarantee you that Emmanuel Macron is wondering why we don't have so many French cheeses on Canadian grocery shelves. It's because of supply management. And so no matter how you want to cut this, if we're going to look elsewhere, everywhere we've looked elsewhere has pointed to supply management and said, hey, we would like access to that market in any type of trade deal. And so the idea that we're going to isolate ourselves now for 10,000 or so farmers just seems so incredibly economically short-sighted and just really disappointing.
Yeah, and it's worth noting because I think people maybe who don't follow this, and you hear the concerns. This is about protecting farmers or farms, and I think people are sympathetic to that. But some of the biggest critics of our position, the biggest critics of Bill C-202, have been others in the ag sector, right? They rely heavily on exports, and they're very worried about what this is doing to our trade agreements.
Exactly, and I've highlighted this over and over and over again because I will see this all the time. Well, if we open up our market, it will get dominated by the Americans, and that will be the end of Canadian dairy. Well, the fun thing is, we already have tried that, and we know that it didn't end up in disaster. We have an open market for American beef. It accounts for, I think, less than 13% of the total market, and we're a tenth of the size of the United States. We don't have supply management for anything else in the ag sector,
Right.
and yet we haven't been completely overrun with American products. And just because something is allowed to enter the country doesn't mean that consumers are going to buy it. That's where the competition aspect comes into play, and where we really see the benefits is because all of a sudden, rather than just having milk from one country and one source, you have competition on grocery shelves, and it can include American products. It can include New Zealand products. It can, like I use the example of Kerrygold butter from Ireland. which is incredibly popular worldwide, impossible to get here because even if it does get here, it's slapped with a 200 to 300% tariff, and so it's priced out of the market.
One of the weird arguments, too, from defenders of the system, because, we got the Kuzma deal with the U.S. that allowed a little bit of a concession for the Americans on these issues. And, defenders of supply management say, well, we don't need to make any more concessions because the Americans aren't meeting that limit. And yet if we make another concession, somehow we're going to be overrun with American products. That seems like a contradictory argument.
Yeah, so we have this all the time whenever I talk to the supporters of supply management, because they'll say, without realizing the cognitive dissonance, they'll say, well, no, U.S. milk isn't cheaper than Canadian milk, while at the same time arguing that if we allow more U.S. milk, it's going to hurt Canadian farmers. Well,
Right.
Wait a second. It can't be both, right? And if it isn't cheaper, then why worry? And the same thing about the quality of U.S. agricultural products, which is predominantly a myth. But if it is worse quality, then what's the threat, right? Canadians would just naturally not pick the suboptimal products if the quality is really that bad. Again, just because something can enter the country, I mean, I use the example of spam. Spam exists. I think it's gross. But the existence of spam doesn't, and the allowance of it on a grocery store shelf doesn't mean that it's completely cannibalizing the market for anything that would be comparable. It just exists, and some people like it, and a lot of people don't.
Exactly. But for Canadians who don't understand how supply management works, I mean, it's a really weird, archaic system where we've got quotas, we've got price controls, we've got tariffs, we've got product that goes to waste each year. It's a weird system.
Incredibly weird system. I mean, I would argue that it doesn't. So the idea that it meets that that the government magically ensures that supply meets demand is false. The research on this has shown that there are billions of liters that have been dumped since 2012, which is an economic cost. It's an environmental cost because there are emissions associated with producing. The idea that it's protecting the family farm is false. Did the dairy industry, I use that as that's primarily what we're talking about, has consolidated like the rest of the agricultural sector over the last 20 years. So that's not true. The only thing that is true is it provides a stable income for these protected farmers, which is true. But I'll put this back to you. Maybe you know the answer or maybe you don't. What is the net income? So after expenses, income for your average quota holder?
Well, those are valuable quotas. I know that.
Yeah. So the average income for a quota holder, according to Statista, is about $250,000 a year after expenses. So it's not like we have supply management and dairy farmers are like scraping by on really modest means and really struggling to make a go of it. It's become a golden ticket. And yeah, I understand they're going to fight tooth and nail to try and protect this, and they've been doing this for a decade. We're both old enough to remember the conservative leadership campaign many years ago, where it was front and center, and they rallied and helped tip the scale in favor of Andrew Scheer. And so, for me, it's just this really, really outdated policy that benefits, in the grand scheme of Canadians, it benefits 10,000 or so supply managed farmers, and the costs are it's incredibly hard for us to trade with the Europeans, with the British, with the Americans, with the Australians or the Kiwis. But then domestically, it inflates prices between 20 and 40%, depending on the product and the season. And that in turn pushes upwards of 189,000 Canadians under the poverty line when we have record numbers of people lining up at food banks because they're struggling to make ends meet. And so for me, it's just a no-brainer in terms of something that we should consider getting rid of. Yes, it would be uncomfortable to give Trump a win, but it would be for our own good.
Yeah. What about, and it's almost like a two wrongs don't make a right kind of argument, but I mean, the U.S. has its own agriculture protectionist type policies, subsidies to farmers, a lot of really weird quotas and tariffs around sugar, for example. Does that in any way justify Canada's position here, justify supply management?
No, No, it doesn't. And it doesn't because, I mean, Martha Hall Findlay has done some great myth busting on this, showing
Mhm.
the subsidies. Because I see this myth perpetuated all the time, that, well, it means that we don't give our dairy farmers subsidies. Well, we did in 2019, 1.75 billion, in exchange for access to the Canadian market, which is a subsidy, and government protection is a subsidy. If I were to add an inflated cost to all of the other podcasts or radio shows, and the only one that wasn't faced with that cost was you, that would be a subsidy to you and your show. In that case, it might be worth it in comparison to what else is out there, but it is a subsidy because protection is a form of subsidy. And so I get the criticisms of the Farm Bill and some U.S. agricultural policy and sugar policy in particular in the U.S., but that's not a justification for hurting ourselves. In the same way that Trump having a economically illiterate view on tariffs is not justification for us to match it, right? Don't match bad policy with bad policy. In fact, if you look at Australia, in all of the hoopla of the tariffs, the prime minister there stood in front of Parliament and said, "I'm not going to retaliate. And yeah, I get that the optics suck here, but tariffs are paid for by you. And why am I going to increase taxes on Australians because there happens to be someone very silly in the White House?" And so that would be my argument. Yeah, the U.S. can have their farm bill and some of the silliness that they have, but that doesn't mean we have to match it or maintain our own silliness.
We'll see where this all goes from here. Much more is mentioned. ConsumerChoiceCenter.org. David, thank you so much for joining us here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, there you go. That is David Clement. He is North American Affairs Manager with the Consumer Choice Center, consumerchoicecenter.org. Coming up in a moment here, we're going to talk about the Canada-U.S. relationship and going beyond just trade. New report from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute calling for a grand bargain, a path to prosperity, security, and strength, tying in trade with energy, security, and defense. We'll hear from Institute Senior Fellow Richard Shimooka, one of the authors of this report. You're listening to the Rob Breakenridge Show. As we've seen this week, things are still a little bit precarious in trade talks between Canada and the U.S., and a lot of questions and uncertainty moving forward as to the relationship between our two countries. There's an interesting new report out from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute via the Center for North American Prosperity and Security that envisions a different path, in a way, a bigger path, a grand bargain, if you will. So you can read more of this report up at macdonaldlaurier.ca. But joining us to talk about maybe a different way forward, very pleased to welcome to the program here one of the authors of this report. Richard Shimooka is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Richard, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
So let's talk about where we're at here, maybe the need now, or almost the urgency perhaps now, for a rethink in our approach with the United States. What is it that this report is envisioning here?
Well, I think it's a confluence of a lot of factors, and the overall report is trying to get away from the sort of the day-to-day or hour-by-hour sort of, policy or foreign relation by tweet or Truth Social that's been going on that we see, and try to build a more sort of stable bargain, I guess you could say, between Canada and the United States that would allow for some of these very sort of epithermal kind of, policy making to sort of go away and not just sort of return Canada-U.S. relations to where it was pre-November 5th, 2024 with the election of Donald Trump's second term, but sort of build on some of the advantages that we have going forward and sort of look for greater prosperity for our two countries that would endure beyond this administration and go forward to the next administration and the foreseeable future.
Right. Now, I think what's interesting about this approach that the report lays out, it's not just about trade or tariffs. Like, this is taking a much bigger look at the totality of the relationship.
Yeah, and I think that there's tactical and broader strategic reasons to do that. One is that, as I said before, if you look at how the Trump administration works, there's a lot of kind of grievance-based politics, but a lot of it is just more about the perceptions of it. And so, I don't think it's just about the administration, but if you think about Congress as well, and in Canada, and sort of civil society groups, businesses, I think they really want to get away from this. It doesn't help the business community whatsoever, especially given the sort of integrated nature of the Canada-US economy, that you have a constant sort of drip of, 25% tariffs. Oh, it's only on USMCA. That's just in the last 24 hours as us recording right here. I think that really doesn't help business confidence whatsoever. It drives up inflation. It drives up disruptions. And so if we can sort of look to a broader sort of a broader sort of agreement, it kind of precludes a lot of that drip, right? So you think about issues with Canada's national defense spending, let's say, right, which has been a pretty long irritant between Canada-US relations that extends far before even Trump's first term. If we can sort of build areas where there is an agreement that just shows that there is a commitment on both sides, that we can actually go forward and build a better North American security compact, for lack of a better word, to deal with the sort of increased threat that the Russian Federation and the Chinese People's Republic of China is presenting to North American security. That's an area that no longer is on the table for disagreement. I think a lot of discussions on supply management or let's say softwood lumber, those are constant irritants, and getting some agreement on those areas kind of prevents this to be leveraged for a future sort of the next 3 years or even beyond that for more sort of discord and problems.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, when we consider the debate around defense spending, we see that as a totally separate track from trade. But really, it is all about this relationship and alliance with the United States. And I think for us to demonstrate that we're a reliable partner and one that the Americans do want to engage with, I think to demonstrate it on that side, it all does tie together in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think I would point to Ed Fast just wrote an op-ed in the Globe Mail, and he wrote the forward to this to our study as well. He said that we shouldn't give up supply management for nothing, because supply management is a pretty long-term issue with the United States, and there's some feeling, I think, that this is coming to a head. I know that there's a bill going through the Senate right now that might the Canadian Senate that might preclude sort of giving this up, but this has been a long festering issue that causes problem. Out for British Columbia, softwood lumber has been an issue decade after decade after decade, right? And it comes back. And so I think there's a way, in some ways, to potentially use some leverage from this, is using Ed Fast kind of conception of it, to sort of build a better agreement that can kind of accentuate some of the sort of the areas where we have domestic advantage that we can push forward. And it just wouldn't be a sort of giving the sacrificing supply management for something else. I think there's ways that we can actually gain some benefits out of this that would potentially bring some increased prosperity or increased benefit, for lack of a better word, for Canada as well.
Well, let's think. You see the upside for Canada here, but what about from the American perspective? What's in it for them, especially within America right now that almost seems like it's looking a little more inward?
I think if you think about this on a very political basis, right now the Trump administration is not popular. And that's just, if you look at all the polling, it's especially just after the passage of the big beautiful bill with these tax cuts, recent polling saying it's at negative 25 points. Right, this is not a popular administration. I think business sentiment is pretty poor. The stock market's going up, but a lot of companies are watching their inventories and they're carrying extra costs associated with tariffs, and they don't like this. And a lot of Americans are watching, the inflation. The reason why they voted against a second term for Biden or Kamala Harris or whoever, in order to sort of go for Donald Trump, who said, "Oh, I'm going to, the price of eggs aren't going to go up a cent," or whatever was his
Right.
phrasing of it, right? And quite the opposite. This has now actually become a serious political liability, and I think a lot of people within Congress who do have a say on these issues are watching this with increasing alarm, saying these tariffs are killing us. This is not a positive benefit for us. No Americans are thinking that this is going to build our economy anymore. We're just paying more for whether it be washing machines or, for food or whatever, right? So I think for them, having this stability in basically, if not their most important bilateral economic relationship, or their second most, if you think about, either China or Mexico, right? However you want to rank it, really kind of puts to bed the potential political risk for the Republican Party. And I think for the Democrats as well, to some degree, constraining the administration is something that's to their benefit. I think they don't love watching this, constant drumbeat of, of tariffs on, tariffs off, and having some sort of agreement with them for them too is a benefit. So I think for all parties that there is there's kind of a confluence of kind of political interest to create an agreement. And if you even think about how the Trump administration has talked about this, he said like, well, I'm going to have 90 days and we're going to have all these trade deals. They want deals. And in a lot of cases, if you think about how they go about their deals, it's not actually about the actual policies to some degree. They're actually pretty agnostic in a lot of cases. They just want the appearance of something being done. And I think that gives a lot of play if you're, for lack of a word, a policy entrepreneur or a trade entrepreneur, that if you are willing to do a bit of dealing here or there and sort of make the appearance of you're exceeding their wishes, but you can get a fair bit out of this. I would point to, I know we're going on here, but if you look at how the NATO summit went just a couple of weeks ago, right? NATO's going to hit 5% in 2035, and there's a review mechanism in 2029 after the Trump administration is gone, right? That's by all appearances, that's just an appearance, right? It's not an actual policy that will not actually follow through during his time in office. And I think that for the administration, they want the appearance of these wins. So I think there's a fair bit of room there politically for Canada to get something if it can kind of look like it's being helpful and positive and being a helpful ally in this area.
Right. When it comes to defense spending, it's interesting because, I think there's been an expectation from Washington for many years now that Canada pick up some of the slack, that Canada do a bit more of the heavy lifting. Here we are now, I think, finally poised to do that or get on the path to doing that. But sort of this knee-jerk reaction to other issues has us looking elsewhere, like with fighter jets. All of a sudden, are we going to look to Europe for fighter jets instead of moving forward with the Americans? So how important is maintaining that close relationship between Canada and the U.S. on defense spending?
Well, I think it really depends what defense spending we're talking. So for a large number of historical reasons, we've got three services, and you have the Navy, you have the Air Force, and you have the Army, and they actually do very different things. It's not like if you think about the United States, where they consider the joint force, where they all work together in a synergistic fashion. Our military basically has three different missions, and they do different things overall. There's a bit of play in there, but it's pretty accurate for when we're talking about foreign threats. And so think about it. The Navy is really Asia Pacific, right? There used to be North Atlantic, but it's really the focus is going to be in Asia Pacific, especially since 2022, right? The Army's basically completely deployed in Latvia. Its whole, force generation model is designed to support 2,200 troops, as part of the enhanced forward presence against potential Russian aggression. And then you have the Air Force is really heavily focused on NORAD and North American security. And if you think about that construct, in some ways, where you're going to buy systems, you probably want them to be near to where you actually, operate them. Now, the Navy is a bit different because we have to integrate it a bit with American systems. So we do buy a fair bit of American stuff, but we're looking at South Korean submarines as one of the buys. So there's a Asian sort of link. It's possible that we might buy a European one, but we'll see. But in general, the Army generally has started buying more European systems, so you're going to see a lot of spending, I would say, from European countries because it's easier to buy there. America doesn't really export a lot of its Army systems. So that leaves the Air Force. And really, if you think about what is the priorities of the Trump administration, especially in defense, it is securing North America. And that's been kind of put into the rubric of Golden Dome, right? With ensuring that we have a complete, 360 protection of the North American continent from space, from air, from sea, and whatnot. So in that construct, the Royal Canadian Air Force is probably the main contributor for Canada's relationships, defense relationships with the United States. And in that, you need to have basically, as we used to be called interoperable, now it's called interchangeable systems. And you think about integration of networks on aircraft, on radars and all that. It's all done through NORAD. And in some ways, that almost precludes us buying anything else. And the reality is that there's really not a way to have the same amount of security with any sort of realistic spending if we were to disengage ourselves from NORAD. And then, so that means we're going to buy F-35s. We're going to buy over-the-horizon radars that can be tied into the North American side. Now, Golden Dome, a big part of the Trump administration's focus. He's talked about using the big portion of that is going to be a space-based interceptor program. I'm not too sure Canada, I don't think he probably wants Canada to be part of it. I'm not too sure Canada really wants to be part of it. He's asked for an indemnity or some sort of payment that Canada would pay as to be part of this program. I don't think that's a realistic thing. I mean, he can't even get the number right. First he says 51. Next time he asks about $61 billion. Like, I don't know if that's an actual real ask, but certainly even before this administration, there was a real push to modernize NORAD against new threats, low-level cruise missiles, hypersonic systems that are coming out of the People's Republic of China and Russia, as well as North Korea. And those spending investments on detection and other systems and networking systems were going to happen anyways. And a lot of those are sort of enablers for the space-based interceptor portion of it. And I think Canada can easily say, hey, we'll support your broader, objectives here. We may even invest in other areas that will, make this even better, but we're going to stay out of this portion of it. You probably don't want us in there. Maybe we'll put some money into NORAD that's a little bit extra and find an agreement there. And I think that that's a realistic area that the Trump administration probably, when you go past the bluster, would probably welcome. And I know within Congress would definitely welcome Canada's sort of increased involvement in this area because we have the preponderance of the distance in the north that we have to cover. Think about over the North Pole and
right.
past agreements. So I mean, there's a real opportunity there, I think, to provide actually have leverage to some degree with the Trump administration. Hey, we're willing to do more, and maybe we can make a deal on, I don't know, autos or software law or something else, right? That's part of the view on the grand bargain, to find a place where we have leverage. And this is actually an area we could have leverage if it's done right.
Yeah, that's an important point. I mean, it is interesting with the Arctic too, because I think there's a need for Canada to address that. And part of it is about, I think, kind of asserting our own sovereignty in the Arctic. And maybe in that sense, it seems paradoxical or counterintuitive that increased reliance on the U.S. helps us assert our own sovereignty in the Arctic. But how can we leverage that relationship with the Americans, what we have through NORAD and continental defense, to really, maximize our ability to assert ourselves in the Arctic?
Well, I think it's a bit of sort of cooperative kind of game theory in some ways, that you think about, look, if we are here and we're a helpful partner and we're going to do more, and the Americans can deal on something else, it's like, hey, we're actually going to be even more ahead because Canada is taking up more of a burden. We are actually providing real value for the United States. Whereas if we think about the very start of the Trump administration, the first couple of weeks or couple months, the really negative zero-sum kind of position or confrontation that we had with the administration really doesn't help either one of us, right? It's not going to be a benefit. And you're going to have a Canada-sized hole in your North American defense if we have a real break, right? And if we can look towards a much more cooperative, sort of synergistic effort in this area, we actually provide for our own security. Like, it's really hard to express how disconnecting Canada from the United States and the NORAD system comes at a severe detriment for our ability to defend the North. Like, you think about, and this is a very granular sort of way, just the amount of surveillance, space-based surveillance, intelligence gathering that the U.S. does that feeds into NORAD, that allows us to detect potential threats coming from Russia. Let's say you think about all those flights with long-range strategic bombers. in a lot of cases, Canada knows that these things before even these aircraft have picked up or have taken off, because the U.S. is very sort of detailed intelligence gathering systems that can tell, hey, it looks like they're preparing one of these flights. You should get ready. And then NORAD gets alerted about what's going on, right? And if Canada is not part of this system, our ability to actually even defend our north is severe, at a severe question mark. And there's really no realistic way Canada would spend enough to regain that on its own, because we're 1/10 of the United States' size, and we just don't have the sort of technology base to conduct this level of security. So I think for both sides, it helps us defend ourselves. And again, within this grand bargain construct, this is designed to build that stability of relations again. That it puts to bed a lot of these irritants, or much of these irritants, so that we're out of the crosshairs of this, right? Trump can go and go after the other sort of recalcitrant sort of states that are not doing the trade, and we can return somewhat to some level of stability where it's not a daily feature of our sort of discussion on foreign policy and economy and whatnot.
Indeed. Well, much more on the grand bargain. The report is up at Macdonald-Laurier.ca. Richard, thank you so much for the insight on all of this. Appreciate making some time for us here today.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay, there you go. That is Richard Shimooka. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Macdonald-Laurier.ca. You can read the new report on what they describe as a new grand bargain between Canada and the United States. Coming up in just a second, we're going to hear from Josh Dehaas with the Canadian Constitution Foundation. We're going to talk about protests in Canada. The foundation has actually released an interesting new guide outlining laws, rights, responsibilities around protests in Canada. And certainly we've seen some large and disruptive protests in recent years, and maybe more to come. Another interesting aspect to all of this are the laws around protests, what we're seeing from some municipalities, even now maybe soon to be the federal government, these so-called bubble zone laws that limit where protests can take place. So we'll get into all of that coming up shortly. This is the Rob Breakenridge Show. A country that in recent years has dealt with the convoy protests, university encampment protests, we could be in for another summer of discontent with calls for nationwide encampment protests across the country related to, once again, the situation in the Middle East. So how do protesters need to deal with this? How do police need to deal with this? There's an interesting new publication from the Canadian Constitution Foundation letting both protesters and police better understand the rights and responsibilities around these kinds of protests. It's called Know Your Rights, a guide to protest in Canada, more at theccf.ca. Josh Dehaas is a counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation and is on the line with us here. Josh, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Rob.
Let's talk about why there's a need for this, first of all. What were you hoping in terms of filling a void with this publication?
Well, the last several years, we've seen tons of protests across Canada about all kinds of issues, from vaccine passports, vaccine mandates, all the way to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And a lot of what protesters are doing is perfectly legal and protected by the constitutional rights to freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly. But a lot of what they're doing is not legal, and it's not protected. And, protesters and police alike don't seem to know where the line is between what's legal and what's not legal. So we thought there was a role for us to step in and explain, here are your rights. Here's what you can do. Here's where you can protest. Here's how you can protest. And here's where you go over the line and step into criminal activity.
Are those lines clear enough, do you think?
So the lines, they could be clearer in some cases for sure. And the reason for that is when you look at your rights, they're outlined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and they're really short. They say you have the right to freedom of expression, you have the right to peaceful assembly, and then there are demonstrably justified limits in a free and democratic society. And courts don't deal with these issues very often. There often aren't arrests made, and courts are not usually asked to delineate, what the word peaceful and peaceful assembly means. So we stepped in and we looked at all of the court decisions that do get into this stuff and decided, okay, there are some clear lines here. There are some things we can advise the public. We can tell police about where the limits are. And so we hope that we can add to some of that clarity.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the big things, and it was kind of the common thread when we had the convoy protests or the encampment protests, is the idea of protesters basically not leaving. Like, it's one thing, a protest, a rally at the legislature, whatever, in an afternoon, but the idea that a protest would sort of have no end, at what point does that cross a line?
So that's really the biggest question. And so what you have to do is look at the word peaceful, and what does peaceful mean here? So peaceful doesn't mean just that you're not acting violently. It means that you're not substantially interfering with the rights of other people, whether it's the right to, also use that public space, that park, or whether it's the right to drive down the street and not be blockaded by other people using their cars, or, standing in the middle of the street trying to coerce you or force you to agree with their message. So if you look at the legal decisions, there's actually more than a dozen decisions that look at blockades, for example. And while we all know that you can use the streets to protest, you can legally march, that's protected activity. Once you start, standing there or blocking people with your cars or your bodies, or even occupying a public space with tents and staying there, overnight, for example, it starts to become reasonable for the government to limit those activities. And, you could be facing charges if you do blockading. You could face trespassing charges if you engage in encampments. Those things are not a legally protected activity under the charter.
Yeah, because I think if we look at, the law pertaining to mischief specifically, or even trespassing, like if we really applied it to the, strict letter of the law, I mean, almost any rally or protest might kind of get caught up in this. But I guess we do allow, and maybe the charter does allow, for some leeway when it comes to peaceful expression of some kind of protest or rally.
Well, I think that there is a pretty clear line, and the line is where you start to coerce other people. So it's one thing to use the public space for protest, whether you're talking about a street march or an encampment. It's another thing once you start coercing other people to not use that space, once you interfere with their right to also use it. And so, that, for example, with an encampment, that probably happens once you start staying overnight. And so you've seen cases where municipalities have said, this is a park, this is a place where people have a right to protest, but we're going to put in a time, place, and manner restriction saying you can't camp here overnight. And courts have tended to uphold those, right? So we know that the line in that case is probably don't stay overnight. And, with the street march, I think that that's a really tough one, because where does the street march become a blockade? I think it becomes a blockade as soon as you start stopping and preventing traffic from moving, more than just sort of fleetingly, because then you're saying this space belongs to me now, and other people who want to use it, too bad, you can't also use that space. So, the moving protest, I think that's almost always going to be protected. The sitting down and blockading and stopping traffic for hours or days on end, I don't think that's going to be protected.
And on the police side of things, the law enforcement side, I mean, we don't want police overreacting. We want to make sure that the right to peaceful assembly, the right to protest is protected. But I think maybe we've seen where police underreact, or we see different kinds of reactions to different protests where, that creates uncertainty, or maybe it even creates double standards. How problematic might that be?
Well, police have a really, really tough job here, and that is the risk, right? Like they know that they have the Constitution to uphold, and that means facilitating peaceful protests, but they're not well educated necessarily on where these lines are, and that can lead them to underreact, and they allow encampments to become entrenched because they don't want to deal with the risk that someone will accuse them of breaching their charter rights, or they allow repeated blockades in Toronto here, for example. They've been happening fairly regularly in relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict. So police are in a tough place, but we have seen in some cases where sort of the squeaky wheel gets the grease type thing, where certain causes seem to get away with illegal activity like blockading or intimidation, and then other causes police just let it go because there's fewer complaints about those, and that can't be right. In a rule of law country, the law has to apply equally. I may hate one protester's message and love another, but the police need to be treating both groups equally. And we're not always seeing that in Canada. We're often seeing police going easy on one group and hard on another, and that just can't be acceptable.
No, absolutely. And then there's the question of the law itself, right? Police don't make the laws, lawmakers do. And the law can and does change. And we're seeing right now where already some municipalities have brought in laws that sort of specify where protests can and can't happen. It sounds like federally, even this idea of bubble zones, that's under consideration. So what's your position on that, first of all?
Well, bubble zones are a really, really bad and unconstitutional response to what is often a real problem. There's been a lot of, criminal intimidation, mischief, hateful speech, excessive noise, all of these things that you can legally regulate going on at certain protests. Again, related in Toronto here, for example, to the Israel-Gaza conflict. And all of those things are, things where there are existing laws in place, whether it's criminal intimidation, mischief, even excessive noise bylaws that are perfectly constitutional, but not being enforced. And so because they haven't been enforced, you have a lot of really unacceptable behavior associated with these protests. And the response of city councils has been, well, let's just ban the protests. Well, that's not acceptable. The whole point of protest and of freedom of expression is that you should be able to express unpopular ideas, because that's how you convince your fellow Canadians that actually, the government has this wrong and there's a better way to look at this particular issue. So bubble zones are the wrong way to go. They are essentially content-based protest bans, when what government should be doing instead is just enforcing the law against those actual criminal activities that are not protected.
So when it comes to sensitive places, I guess if that's the right word, like schools or places of worship, and I know that's kind of been part of the justification for these laws, how then do we sort of protect that if it's necessary? Does that mean trespassing, or does that mean, as you say, other laws that already exist?
Yeah, so I think that what you see with these bubble zones is people say, well, it started with abortion clinics. These are sensitive places. Women are in a vulnerable state when they go here. They shouldn't have to deal with protests. Then it spread to hospitals during COVID, while nurses and doctors and patients, they shouldn't have to deal with protests. Then it became schools. Now it's places of worship. If you look at the bubble zone laws that are being put in place in my part of the country in Toronto, they cover so much land potentially that you wouldn't be able to march or protest anywhere. And often there are very legitimate reasons to protest outside of a school, a hospital, a church. Think of a residential school survivor who wants to protest outside of a Catholic church. She should be able to do that in a free country. So the solution really needs to be better enforcement of actual criminal activity that doesn't have to do with the speech, but has to do with the way that it's being expressed, or that's happening at the same time, like that criminal intimidation where you're blocking somebody from getting into a synagogue or a mosque. Police can and should arrest people for that. Or if you're blasting noise at 100 decibels outside of a hospital and you're disturbing the people inside, there's nothing wrong with city bylaw officers coming and ticketing that person, making that noise stop. So focus on the physical consequences or the form of the speech, but don't start, banning speech outside of all of these places, because that's really a content-based restriction, and it's really censorship at the end of the day.
Yeah, which speaks, I guess, too, to the role of the courts in all of this. I mean, these laws are being challenged in court. Certainly, we saw some really consequential court decisions with regard to the use of the Emergencies Act, which was deployed against the protests in Ottawa. So how important are the courts in responding to these situations and helping us all better understand these lines?
Yeah, the courts have a really, really important job here, and that is to settle these disputes and explain to people what is covered by your right to peaceful protest and what is not peaceful and not acceptable in a free country. And so, that's what the CCF does. We raise money, and we, for example, right now we're raising money to challenge municipal censorship, including things like these bubble zones, because they can tell us where the line is. And when people know where the line is, whether it's the protesters or the police, we're all going to be able to go out there and get our message across and protest and try to convince our fellow citizens about who's right in any controversial debate. But when we don't know, what we end up with is chaos, and that can often lead to violence because people turn to self-help. They want to go and take that blockader out of the street and physically move them out of the way if police aren't going to do it for them. So people need to figure out what these rules are, and courts are slowly but surely defining those for us.
Absolutely. Well, it's called Know Your Rights, a guide to protesting Canada. It's up at theccf.ca, as well as further background on some of these related important issues. Josh, thank you so much for your insight on this, and appreciate making some time for us here.
Thanks so much, Rob.
Okay, that is Josh Dehaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Back to wrap things up right after this. All right, just as we wind things down on this episode of the podcast, one other issue I did want to touch on briefly, and it's going to be something to keep an eye on through the summer. A lot of eyes on a by-election happening here in Alberta on August 18th in the riding of Battle River Crowfoot. Now, voters in that riding, just like voters right across the country earlier this year, voted in a federal election. But in that election, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre lost his seat in Ottawa. And so the incumbent for this riding, Damien Carrick, resigned the seat, opening it up for Pierre Poilievre to run in a by-election. So this is seen as a very safe Conservative riding. Mr. Carrick received, I think, just over 80% of the vote in the recent federal election. But still, there's some challenge here for Pierre Poilievre in overcoming some apathy. Voters in this riding knowing that the result's not going to affect the makeup of the House of Commons, not going to change who's governing the country. And the other element at play here, well, I suppose there's the factor of just the fact that they're having to go through all of this again. They just voted. And is there that element of frustration that you're being asked to do this all over again just a few months later? But of course, here in Alberta right now, and precipitated in part by how that federal election went, is this whole conversation around Alberta separatism. And as we've talked about on this show, there's some actual, dueling petition efforts, both aimed at prompting a vote on this question, but it all just comes down to how that question might be shaped. But it does feel like one way or another, Alberta's headed in that direction, a referendum at some point on whether Alberta should remain a part of Canada. Now, that separatist sentiment, I think, is largely concentrated amongst conservative-minded Albertans, and maybe arguably more so concentrated in rural areas. So that becomes a factor here in this riding of Battle River Crowfoot. And is that something that could cause problems for Pierre Poilievre? A lot of these conservative voters may be feeling alienated or frustrated to the point where they might not even want to vote in a federal election. Maybe they've written off Canada or written off federal conservative parties altogether. So it is a question, I suppose, that is going to dog Pierre Poilievre a bit here through this campaign. I think he's still likely to win comfortably, but it just maybe makes it a little more uncomfortable than perhaps he would prefer. Speaking of the reporters in Ottawa on Monday, Pierre Poilievre was asked about all of this, and here's his response. And I suppose you're going to hear it from him more than once between now and August 18th, but how he's going to respond to this separatist sentiment in Alberta and in his riding.
Well, I disagree with separation. I'm a Canadian patriot. I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, and I understand the frustration. I still think that there's no other country in the world where someone of my modest origins would be able to make it to this place, and that's the story that millions of people have lived and relived from across the country. So we are united by that Canadian promise. But as I say, and I say it here, and I've been saying for years, we have to put a final end to this notion that Ottawa tells Alberta to pay up and shut up, and that's what Albertans have been told by this Liberal government for a decade. Their frustrations are entirely legitimate. Alberta is the number one net contributor, per capita contributor to Confederation, paying more in tax than getting back in federal programs. The major industry of Alberta has been under relentless attack for the last 10 years. The rural and western way of life is under attack with ridiculous gun bans, all while allowing repeat offenders to go and terrorize communities, including rural communities where crime is now, for the first time in a generation, a serious danger in communities where people didn't even have to lock their doors. So I say all of that to point out that the frustration is real and it is legitimate. and we should neither dismiss it nor deride the people who hold those frustrations. It's the job of all federal leaders and, frankly, all members of Parliament to redress the very unfair treatment that Western Canada has been receiving, and I pledge to do that. I understand it. For me, it's personal. I was born in '79. It was a few years later that Trudeau, hit us all with the big national energy program. My folks were teachers, so they didn't lose their jobs like so many others, but we got smashed with the 20% interest rates on mortgages like everyone else. And I grew up understanding that the federal government had viciously attacked the Alberta economy. And so one of the reasons I got into politics was to bring fairness to my province and to my region. And we'll continue to fight for that by repealing the anti-energy laws, unlocking free enterprise, shrinking the size of the federal government so more of Alberta's money stays in the hands of Albertans, getting rid of the dumb gun laws and instead locking up the real criminals. That's how we redress the very real and legitimate frustration of Albertans, and that's how we unite all Canadians. One last thing I would say is, let's build alliances. Albertans should build alliances with Newfoundlanders and Labradorians who want to develop their oil and gas. They want to develop, our Newfoundland and Labrador cousins want to double their production. We should support that. Let's develop alliances with coastal First Nations who want to liquefy and export Alberta's natural gas over to Asia to get $14 instead of $3 for it. Let's build alliances with Greater Toronto Area communities that want an end to catch and release, to lock up criminals, or to miners in Timmins who want to develop resources or who want to keep their hunting rifles. That's how you get things done. Build alliances to get good results that serve Albertans and all Canadians.
Okay, so that was Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre speaking in Ottawa on Monday. And that's another challenge for him right now in leading this party, but also trying to focus on what's going on in Alberta in this riding. Of course, Pierre Poilievre, like many other political leaders, was in Calgary for Stampede. And then there's the whole matter of campaigning in Battle River Crowfoot in Alberta. And that by-election, as mentioned, set for August 18th. And we'll have much more on that story as we get closer. But listen, that's going to do it for us on this edition of the show. Our thanks once again to David Clement from the Consumer Choice Center, Richard Shimooka with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and Josh Dehaas with the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Don't forget, you can subscribe at our Substack page. You can find that at robbreakenridge.ca. That's also where this podcast is hosted. You can find the podcast on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. We've got a YouTube channel as well. At Rob Breakenridge Show. You can find us video content on YouTube. We'll be back with another episode for you on Friday. My name is Rob Breakenridge. We'll talk to you then. Take care.